Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and for my Lightroom video training series, I'm going to talk about the Develop module. The Develop module is where you get all the heavy lifting done in Lightroom. And in fact, if you get really good at it, you will hardly ever need to use Photoshop or another more serious app. Now, Develop doesn't do everything, but it can do almost everything. So let's get in with the kind of light stuff. Let's learn how to zoom in pixel per pixel. I'll open up Lightroom here. So select a baby picture here, and then in this top pane, I'll select the Develop module. You can also switch between modules by holding down both the Control and Alt keys, and then pressing 1 for Library, 2 for Develop, 3 for Map, and so on. So Control Alt 2 will jump you over to Develop. Now, as you learned before, you can zoom just by clicking, and that's a great way just to check the details of the picture. But I often find it's useful to zoom in even further. So over here in the navigator pane, you can zoom in to 3:1. That means that each individual pixel here is shown 3 times larger than it actually is. So we'll see about basically 3 pixels for every one. And this is a great way to get really close and make sure that the focus is perfect. And it's also a good way to make very fine adjustments. So if I just want to remove this one wrinkle in the baby's eye, there'd be no need to, but if I wanted to, I could zoom in really tight and then get really precise with these brushes. We'll reset that because this baby's eyes are perfect. Now you'll notice in the navigator here, and it works the same in the Library module, Fit fits the picture in either vertically or horizontally, whichever is smaller. So none of the picture will be hidden up. If you do Fill, it expands it so that either the horizontal axis or the vertical axis fills the frame, and some of the picture will be cropped off unless it happens to be a perfect match. So you can see here, Fit squeezes it in a little bit. When I do Fill, just a part of the picture gets cropped off. 1:1 shows you each individual pixel, and then 3:1 zooms in 3:1. If you want to change that maximum magnification, click that list, and you can go all the way up to 11:1. Okay, so here I can very clearly see every individual pixel. So while I'm doing this, I'll show you another trick I have, and that's to hold the spacebar down when I'm navigating. And this also works in the Library view. As I'm holding on the spacebar, the cursor turns into a hand, and that lets me grab it and move it. So as you can see here, I'm using a brush. Here I'm using a hand. Just allows you to quickly pan around. That works in Photoshop too. It's my favorite tip of all. If you hold down the spacebar, you can also quickly zoom in and out just by clicking your mouse. Those keyboard shortcuts, they're gonna save you, I'll tell you what. Now let's talk about using the histogram panel in the Develop module. You'll find that it's exactly the same as it is in the Library module, but I will go into a little more detail and show you a couple of tricks that you can use to find overexposed and underexposed parts of your picture. Not that that's always a bad thing. Let's look at Lightroom. Now you can see this is what I'd call a high key picture, because as we look at it, it has lots of white throughout the whole picture. And you can tell by looking at the histogram that the histogram peaks over here to the right because there's lots of white. Well, right now it's properly exposed. Nothing's going off the right edge, nothing is going off the left edge. And we'll get to this in a little bit. What if I crank up this exposure and just pretend I overexposed the picture? It starts to look really blown out, right? Well, you can tell the histogram to show this to you by clicking this little white arrow up here. When I click that, it's going to show anything that's overexposed in bright, bright red. So you can see all of this part of the picture here is completely overexposed, and the part that's not red is properly exposed. So as I drop that down, we'll see the exposure get better and better. So why would you want to use that? And the answer is because you can't trust your eyes. I know that seems crazy for a photographer to say, but when you're looking at a monitor, the way you perceive how bright or dark something is depends on a lot of factors besides just the actual brightness of your photo. It depends on the ambient light in your room. If you're in a really dark room, something that's just gray might seem really bright. If you're in a bright room with light behind you, that same brightness might seem kind of dark. Depends on your monitor calibration too, and many other factors. Now, some people say, oh, you need to get your monitor calibrated, and you can. That's more for designers and photographers though, because you'll still have all those ambient factors that can influence everything. What you need to do instead is to master that histogram. And don't trust your eyes, trust the histogram. For many people, they would look at this picture on their computer and think that it was overexposed. But you look at this histogram and know for sure. And that's one of the most common mistakes I see people make with their photo editing is they'll think an exposure is fine, but then I'll get it on my computer and think it's wildly underexposed. People are going to be looking at it on their smartphones and tablets and computers in bright rooms and computers in dark rooms. They'll be looking at it everywhere. The only way to be sure that your exposure is spot on is to work that histogram. Make sure it fills it up. So now we want to show you how to see this shadow clippings, but that picture was too bright. So let's pick this cute baby picture. Oh, he's yawning. What a cute baby. Looking at this histogram, jump into the develop module, you can see everything's over here on the left. That's because it's a low key picture, and that's okay. That's deliberate. I wanted the background dark. If I want to see all the areas that are underexposed, I'll click that, and oh, you know what? Here you can start to see there's a little gradation in my blacks. You can see that I had the mom holding this black blanket over her, and you probably can't see it here, but there is a little bit of detail in there, and anything that's completely underexposed is going to show up as blue. So if I raise the exposure here, you'll see those blues just disappear. Oh, look, the baby got overexposed and became red because I have this selected. So these are some useful ways to use the histogram. As I go darker and darker, you'll see more and more of that background just becoming completely black. All right, if you thought that was cool, check this out. You can actually grab the histogram and drag the exposure around. This is so cool. I am gonna grab this left edge here where all the darks are, and I'm just gonna drag it with my cursor. I'm gonna drag it to the right, and that's gonna brighten up the exposure. So you can see what I did is I just grabbed the portion of the frame that was in that part of the histogram and I brightened it up. Now I can grab this second quarter here, grab it, and drag it up to brighten it. Wow, look how cool that is. I just revealed all my secrets. It turns out, even though it looked black, my camera, I was shooting raw, it managed to capture so much shadow detail that you can completely reveal my set if you manipulate the histogram correctly. So that kind of worked against me. But you can use that histogram to make your pictures look better too. Let's say this is what your picture turned out like. You could just grab that peak and drag it down, drag it down, drag it down. So let's jump back to our high key picture, or a high key picture at least. And as you can see here, if I decide that I actually don't want this stuff overexposed, I can grab it and drag it down. And as you can see, it's becoming kind of shades of gray. As it moves from one section of the histogram to another, I might have to release it and re-drag it because you can only drag within a single section. So that's a quick way to adjust your exposure of just specific parts of the picture. You know, this is a high key picture, so it really doesn't have blacks in it, but if I wanted blacks in it, I could grab these shadows here and drag them to the left. I could grab this middle part and drag it down here, and then drag that farther down, and then drag this even farther down. Then I could pull this back up, pull this back up. So now what we have is a very high contrast picture, which is not at all an appropriate look for a baby picture, but hopefully you can see how this could be applied elsewhere. I love how you can drag the histogram around. Let's just put that back, rescue that poor baby. Now let's talk about rotating and flipping your pictures. You know, maybe you took the picture like this, but the camera registered it as horizontal. Usually it fixes it automatically, but if it doesn't, it's really easy to fix. Jump into Lightroom here, and oh, we're gonna turn this baby sideways. Oh no. Go to the photo menu, and then you can select rotate left or rotate right. Keyboard shortcuts of Control and bracket. So now you can see he's on his side. I'm going to use the keyboard shortcuts to spin him all the way around. He's a boy, he likes that kind of stuff. Now I'll go into the photo menu here and choose either flip horizontal or flip vertical. So what's the difference between that and rotating? One's a mirror image and one's a rotation. So you can see the baby's now flipped left to right as opposed to being flipped upside down. You can also make that change from the library module. When you're in the grid view, you can see these little arrows at the right and left corners. Just do that to turn your pictures on its side. Now everybody who watches my photography review knows I do a lot of cropping. Cropping is basically a way to zoom in a little tighter on your subject. And in Chapter 1 of Studying Digital Photography, I specifically recommend shooting a little bit wide and giving yourself room to crop later, because you don't know if your picture is going to be an 8x10 which requires cropping on the sides, or maybe shown in a 16:9 video, which requires cropping at the top and bottom, or maybe you'll need to crop it vertically. Or maybe you just didn't zoom in tight enough because you couldn't get close enough to your subject. Either way, cropping can fix all of these things. Cropping can also fix horizons that aren't level, my own personal pet peeve. So let's get into Lightroom and I'll show you all about the cropping tool. This is my daughter Madeline in a silhouette on sunset, and I'll go ahead and hit the crop tool right here. I frequently use the R key to do this. In fact, I'll show you a trick. Jumping back to the grid view by pressing G, I can select a picture and then press the R key to jump right into the crop in the develop module. So I frequently do that to go from the grid view right into cropping, because cropping is almost always the first thing I do. I'll also show you that as you're looking from top to bottom here, this is the workflow that I use too. I look at the histogram, then I look at these tools at the top, like cropping and spots. Then I go down here to the basic stuff, temperature, tint, exposure. So I always work from top to bottom. So starting at the top with the crop, I can decide what the composition I want here is. And maybe what I want is for Madeline to be aligned with the rule of thirds. You can see I'm showing the rule of thirds grid here. I'll pull this side in and it squeezes it in a little bit. And now I can hit enter to finish the crop. But that might not be exactly the effect that you want. So I cropped in from the side, and while I did that, I also changed the aspect ratio of the photo. And from going from my original perspective, which was kind of like this, I changed the aspect ratio to more like this. Like it went from an 8:12 shape to an 8:10 shape. Sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. And crop gives you complete control over this. So let's undo that crop, and I'll press the R key to jump back into the crop again. And now you can see the aspect here is set to the original, but this lock is unlocked. So if I want to keep the original aspect ratio, which would kind of hide the fact that I cropped it, I'll just lock that. And now when I try to crop it, oh, you can see it crops the top and the bottom too, so that it keeps the same aspect ratio. I almost always keep the aspect ratio original until I decide to do something different. You can also choose different aspect ratios. So depending on the camera you have, the original aspect ratio might be a little different. But me, I used to shoot a lot of medium format, 6x6 specifically, and I really learned to love that just square perspective. And often I want to crop my pictures to square. So I'll go into crop here, and for the aspect ratio, I'll choose 1:1. That gives me a square perspective. Now I can just recrop that in a square shape. Really depends ultimately how you're going to use your photo, whether you want it to be an 8x10 or a square, maybe where you're going to put the frame, or whether it's going to be your Facebook profile picture or the Facebook banner, which is a completely different shape. These are the things that you'll want to change the aspect ratio for. So besides just changing the shape, let's get into the crop here and reset it. I'll click reset to go back to the original. This is also great for rotating it. So look at the horizon line here. You can see this should be straight, but it's not. And you know, maybe I want to rotate it more and put a Dutch tilt on it. That's not a bad look. Or maybe I want to straighten it and get a little more accurate with it. I'll just look at those grid lines and then line that fence right up with it. There we go. So now this is a perfectly straight photo, and by default, I prefer to just use a level horizon. If I decide I want a Dutch tilt or something, that works great, but I want it to be a deliberate choice. I don't ever want you to have level horizons or not level horizons unless you've specifically decided to do that. Crop can do a few other things too. Let's open up the crop tool by pressing R, and now I will simply drag my cursor around where I want it to crop. I have the aspect ratio constrained, so it will only let me draw in a shape either horizontally or vertically. Let's say I'll go tight on her face like this and align her with the left rule of thirds, pressing enter. Now, what if I change my mind and I want to go vertical with this picture? I can do that just by grabbing the corner here and dragging it down far enough until Lightroom just decides, oh, you want this to be vertical instead of horizontal. It'll keep that same aspect ratio, but flip it 90 degrees for me. There we go. Maybe I wish I turned my camera sideways and I didn't. It might not be too late, so long as you're able to do a pretty tight crop on it. I'll also point out that there's a slider here in case you want to change the angle and be a little more precise about it. You might prefer this over using it elsewhere. Now, if you're planning to get prints made, you might want to take control of the cropping yourself, because The lab, wherever you get your prints made, will decide that they're going to crop it for you if you do an 8x10, and they'll just kind of arbitrarily cut things off the side. And if you're careful about your composition, it might not be the composition you want. So I like to go into Lightroom and crop it to 8x10 or whatever deliberately. So I'll show you quickly how to do that. Once again, I'll press the R key, and now for the aspect ratio, I'll choose the shape of the print that I'm going to get, 4x5 or 8x10 or 5x7 or whatever it is. We'll do an 8x10. And you can see right away this vertical picture became shorter. If I grab this and go horizontal with it, you can see it's not nearly as wide as the original photo is. Anyway, you don't necessarily have to do that because your photo lab will crop it automatically for you, but I don't like to leave important decisions like composition up to my photo lab. I like to do it myself. So now let's talk about crop guides, and those are those kind of lines that it draws on while you're in the process of cropping. You can control that, and you can choose from a bunch of different crop guides, and it's actually really useful. Jumping into Lightroom here. So I can go into the Tools menu, and then under Crop Guide Overlay, select the overlay that I like. So maybe I want this diagonal one. I don't know why, but you might want that. And here, I'll unlock this, and you can see how the diagonal one behaves. It kind of changes depending on the aspect ratio. If you're square, then it shows that you're perfectly square, and I guess that's what that one is good for. If I select triangle, you can see it does this, which is almost mathematical. The golden ratio is a nice one that some people like to work with. It just shows you the, not quite the rule of thirds, but instead the golden ratio within the picture itself. For me, I'm still a guy who likes the thirds. This is the golden spiral, and you can just see that it's showing you specific proportions. And maybe you have a picture where you want to kind of take advantage of it. This picture does have so much geometry in it that it might kind of work, and I might be able to use that to my benefit. But for me, I always go back to the thirds grid. That's just my favorite crop overlay. Now let's talk about spot removal. This used to be something you had to go into Photoshop to do, but it's so much easier in Lightroom. You can remove a stray piece of trash from the road or remove a pimple from somebody's face. It's downright amazing. So I'll show you how to do it. Here we have a picture of Copenhagen, and it's already been processed a little bit, but maybe you don't like every little bit of detail in here. Zoomed into 11:1 accidentally. Let's zoom back to 1:1. For example, I can see a couple of artifacts in here. I can go up to the Develop module and then select this spot removal tool here. You can do it by pressing Q2. I'm using this scroll wheel on my mouse to change the size up and down, as you can see, like that. So when it's nice and small, about the same size as my subject, I'll just click it. And then Lightroom erases it. Just grabs another section of the picture that it thinks is about the same color as that should be. Smaller things, you want a smaller cursor. You want it to be just about as small as you can get. And so now when I click close to hide that tool, you can see those obstructions just disappear. How cool is that? You can do a lot, but you can't do everything with this. The spot removal tools in Photoshop are definitely more powerful, but I find myself getting everything done in Lightroom very often. And one of the differences you'll see between Lightroom 4 and 5 is that in Lightroom 5, you can drag your spot removal tool. You don't have to just click anymore. So let's go over to this line here on the mast of this boat, and let's pretend it's a power line and we don't want it there anymore. Here's what I can do in Lightroom 5. I can just drag it along this whole thing. And you can see Lightroom just picked a section right above it, and it's not perfect. If you really zoom in there, if you look really close, you can see a little bit of the edges, but it's not bad. If I didn't want that line there, then it's better than it was before. Sometimes it'll be completely imperceptible, and sometimes it won't quite be. Now, there are a couple of different modes that you can use this in. Heal and clone, and heal is the default, and it's what you'll use most of the time. If you choose heal, let's say I want to heal this section here and just remove this flag, it's going to intelligently blend things in. So as you look at this edge right here, you can see there's still some little bit of pink left, and it kind of took the edges and blended them together, and it's pretty smart. It tried to continue this piece of dark cloud and brought it over here. But let's reset that, and let's use the clone tool instead and see how that differs. So what it did here is, there's no intelligence about it. It just copied a section from here. It didn't try to blend anything in. Both those tools are useful for different things. The heal tool is going to be your go-to tool 95% of the time. The times I use clone are if I'm fixing something in a brick wall, for example, where I don't want things blended in, where I can match it up perfectly and I just want an exact duplicate of it. There are a few more parameters you can tweak on this tool. I'll open it up again, and if you screw it up, just click reset or go into your history. Of course, I find it easier to adjust the size using my wheel on my mouse. You can also adjust the feather. So remember how I fixed that line here before and it was still kind of rough? What I'll do is I'll increase the size of the feather, make it a nice big feather, and then I'll make my cursor a little bigger too. And if you look at the edges of the wheel here, as I adjust the feather up, you can see the difference between the outer wheel and the inner wheel becomes bigger. The inner wheel is what's going to be replaced 100%. And then everything in that outer wheel is going to be replaced a little bit less than that. So I'll make this really big so that we can see it. So here, everything inside the circle is going to be completely erased. And here is going to be blended. So just pick how much blend you want. It's almost always better to have at least a little bit of feathering in there, but we don't need quite that much. So let's narrow it down a little bit. Now I'll make this nice and small. Now if I erase this line here, what we'll see is a much smoother transition. You also don't have to 100% erase things. You can control the opacity of your healing tool. This is useful if you want to blend two areas together. This example isn't the best for it, but I'll continue using this. I'll set the opacity here to 50%, and that just kind of blends your new clone in with the original picture. So I'll erase this with the opacity set at 67%. And when I hit close, you can see part of the flag remains. It didn't completely erase it. One other trick I'd like to show you applies to many of the different panes in the develop module, and that's the ability to quickly turn it on or off. I like to do this if I think I might have screwed something up, or if I just want to show somebody, oh look at all the differences that the clone tool made. So there's this little switch that you would never notice. Just click that and it turns everything on or off without erasing it all. If you do want to erase everything, if you just mess it up, just click that reset button right there and it all goes away. Now let's talk about Lightroom's ability to correct red eye. If you use on-camera flash or anytime a flash is really close to the lens, you can get reflections in the person's eyes that usually show up as red for people. Sometimes with animals will show up as green or blue. Lightroom could fix all of that for you. It's always better to get that flash up off the camera a little bit. Check chapter 3 of Stunning Digital Photography. But let's jump into Lightroom and just fix a sample photo that I took. I'm gonna click the red eye correction tool here, and it wants you to drag from the center of the eye just to cover up all the various red in there. So I'm gonna click in the center and then kind of drag out. There you go. So as you can see, as I click in each different eye, it just intelligently finds it. Well, that one wasn't that intelligent, was it? I'll just undo that and we'll just try that again. This is one of those times when you want to just really zoom in nice and tight. So I'll get in real tight using the space bar to turn my cursor into hand. So now I clicked right in the center and then dragged it out. There we go. So now as I look at the before and after here, you can see on the left, ugly, and on the right, quite natural appearance of flash. That's all there is to the red eye tool. Now let's talk about using the graduated filter. A graduated filter is just like a graduated filter that you might attach to the front of your lens. It applies your settings a whole bunch to, say, the top of your picture and less to the bottom of the picture, or vice versa. It's graduated. It kind of goes up or down slowly. This next tool over is the graduated filter tool. You can press M to get to it quickly. And what you can do when you establish your mask is cause it to go, say, from top to bottom. And as you can see, it's going to apply the filter effect more to the top and less to the bottom. So just to go crazy, I'll crank the exposure way up here. And we can see that it's making the top here very bright and the bottom not so much. Now there are a few different ways you can use this. If you don't want the filter to apply to the bottom at all, don't drag it all the way to the bottom. Maybe I just want to brighten up that top part of the sky, but I don't want to have too much impact on the buildings itself. As you can see, this allows you to apply a filter to just part of the picture, and we'll show you a couple of other ways to intelligently do that. But because it's blending it in smoothly, it's not nearly as obvious as it would be if you just applied it to the whole picture or applied it to half the picture. Now, besides dragging it down, you can also rotate it around. So let's reset that, and I'll show you that besides just dragging it straight down, you can also pull it in at an angle. Maybe you just want to make the sky nice and bright in one corner to kind of simulate the sun being up there. Let's pull that exposure right up. Voila, you've got like an instant sun coming out of the left, and it looks quite subtle. You really wouldn't notice it. Graduated filters can be really subtle. Of course, you have most of the same effects that you have when doing other aspects of Lightroom. So I could, up the saturation for just part of the picture or lower the saturation. I could increase the contrast to bring out more of the contrast or decrease the contrast. What if you want more of the effect at the bottom of the picture instead of the top of the picture? Easy. Instead of dragging from top to bottom, just drag from the bottom up. You might often do this with landscape pictures to better balance the exposure of your bright sky and the darker colors of the ground and other terrestrial things. A radial filter works almost exactly the same way, except instead of being like a big long line, it's a circle. So let's jump back into Lightroom. I'll select the radial filter tool here. So you can see that as I did that, I have the exposure up, and we can kind of see where it's applying. You can see that it applied it kind of the opposite of what you might expect. It applied the radial filter everywhere outside of the circle. If that's not what you want, just select this invert mask checkbox there. So now we're kind of making a sun. Get that in there. Oh, it looks like an alien sun. Okay, there we go. So I'll pull that right up in the corner here, and let's just crank up the brightness way up because it is the sun after all. Now, down here at the bottom, you'll see we have the option to feather it. If I feather it very little, it's going to be a perfect circle. If I feather it a lot, it's going to be much more smooth. You don't have to make it just a circle. You can drag sides here just to make it elliptical. Now let's talk about one of the most sophisticated tools in Lightroom, and so sophisticated that kind of blows me away. It's something that used to only be in Photoshop. It's the adjustment brush. You can get to it by pressing K. It actually allows you to select an area of the picture intelligently and then do stuff with that area. So let's continue using this picture, and we'll just select the sky here. You can see that I have the exposure cranked up a little bit, so it's going to be upping the exposure for me. Now, what I'm doing is I'm just trying to select the entire sky. So this allows you not just to apply something to a line or a circle, but to just whatever area you can drag your cursor around. So you could kind of see where I was painting because I had the exposure turned up, thus everything was becoming a little brighter. But if you just want to see where you're painting, you can turn on the selected mask overlay. There's a checkbox down here, or you can just push the O key to turn it on or off. And this can help you just get it a little more precisely. You might want to paint in a couple other areas of the sky. You can see I'm feathering here at the edges of this circle to make the blending a little more natural. Now I can also auto mask it. And that will make it a little bit more intelligent. In fact, let's try resetting all of this, and we'll redo it with the auto mask enabled. Now, as I get in close to the building, look how it's just going right up to the edge of the building, but not completely painting it in. If I want to get in between those two chimneys, I'll just make my cursor nice and small and then just kind of paint in there. So you can see you can adjust your cursor size to really get into the nooks and crannies. These are selections that you used to have to do in Photoshop, and I think it's so amazing that you can do all of this in Lightroom now. And of course, after you get your selections painted, you can do whatever you want with it. So I'm kind of using a precision brush to get in nice and tight around the building. Oh, it doesn't take too much skill at all. It's so fast, and that's what Lightroom is all about, just a fast workflow. It's just like painting, right? You use a small brush around the edges, and then when you're painting the whole wall, use a nice big fat roller. And this is my big fat roller. So I'm just filling that sky in. So now I've got the whole sky selected. I'm happy with my mask. I'll just hit that O key to turn the mask off, but I know it's selected. So now I can go in and, so let's say I want to just adjust the exposure. Now I'm independently controlling the exposure of the sky. Maybe I want even more contrast in this sky. Let's tweak these a little bit. Give me just a real nice contrasty sky. Or maybe I decide in the sky that there's just too many shadows, that I don't want it to seem dark. I can just lift those shadows up and soften them. I can raise the whole exposure up. And you can see I'm doing all of this and none of it is touching the building itself. Lightroom has pretty intelligently selected just the background. Now, I do want to give you a caveat. If you zoom in really tight through here, I'll crank this exposure way up just so we can see the difference. If I zoom in real tight, you'll see some artifacts around the edges. So you can see it's just not perfect. And like, what is that? We don't really want that there. That's kind of what Photoshop is for. If you want to get rid of this ugliness, you're gonna have to bring it into Photoshop and kind of touch it up manually. I mean, you could do some of it with Lightroom, but it's just gonna be kind of slow. You can see, I can kind of paint this in. And if I reduce the feather size here, I can be pretty precise with it, but I'll turn off auto masking. So now I can just really go in and clean that up. But I find that Photoshop is just easier and quicker to do these kinds of things in. But with that said, the adjustment brush is great for quick edits, and for most people, it's gonna be 100% just fine, good enough. Now let's move on to the basic panel where you're gonna spend most of your time and get most of your editing done. Here's a picture of my lovely wife and daughter. There are a bunch of different things that I might wanna do for this picture. I always work from the top to the bottom. So the first thing you'll decide is if you want to do color or black and white. And actually black and white is a good choice for this picture because just look at my daughter's outfit. She's like 8 here, and 8-year-olds like bright colors, and black and white de-emphasizes the color and pushes your emphasis to the shapes and the forms rather than those bright colors, which might have too much visual weight, but that's all covered in chapter 2 of Stunning Digital Photography. So we'll go back to color here, and working from the top down, we can adjust the white balance. So there's a list here for the white balance. I could select cloudy, and that would warm it up a little bit, or I could select shade. If I select daylight, it's gonna seem a little bit cooler. And those are gonna be fine if you happen to know what the right setting is or you don't mind browsing through. But what I find works really well is to use this dropper, the white balance selector tool, and then select something white in the picture. Bam. So what we see there is, they're in the setting sun, so it actually was pretty warm, and you can see how warm the light is on her body. So what I did was I selected the white that was kind of in the shade, and that was a little bit cooler. And Lightroom says, okay, this is what white really is, and makes that white, and then adjusts everything else very naturally around it. So if you have a picture that has some perfectly white part of it, or even a gray part, just something that's neutral, that doesn't have color to it, that white balance selector tool will work wonderfully to make sure that it's all perfect. Now I'll add that if you have multiple light sources, if you have the sunlight and tungsten lights, you're not gonna find one white balance that's completely perfect. You could then use graduated filters or adjustment brush to selectively apply white balance to different parts of the picture. It gets pretty complex, but you don't have to worry about that most of the time. So with our white balance set perfectly, I can also manually adjust the color temperature or the tint. And these are two separate things. So the temperature kind of goes from cool to warm. So from blues to reds, basically oranges. Pull that, I like it right about there. So the tint goes from green to purple. So these are basically two different axes on our color wheel, and they can both be adjusted independently. But again, I feel like this is a rat's hole, because once you start adjusting those things, you stop seeing colors for what they are. And anytime I've adjusted those, I found that I end up with some really weird colors eventually. That's why I prefer to use that dropper. So I'm gonna just reset that by grabbing my dropper and setting it back on Chelsea. So let's continue working our way down. The tone compromises all these different settings, and auto tone actually works pretty well. You can just click auto, and it's gonna look at your picture and figure out what the brightest parts of it should be and what the darkest parts of it should be, and just kind of works magically. And I kind of like that. I will start out with the auto tone, and assuming it doesn't completely screw it up, I make all my adjustments starting from that auto toning point. So working our way down manually, you can see right at the top is the exposure. And this literally adjusts the entire exposure of your picture as if you had used exposure compensation. So it's not a bad technique to blow out the background. So maybe I'll raise that exposure up a little bit. Now the exposure is going to try to rescue shadows or highlights from your picture. If you drop that exposure down, it's going to have to pull some highlights. If you remember to shoot raw like I recommend, it's going to be able to find some highlights that you can't see in the picture. And for most cameras, you can drop the exposure by 2 stops and still have perfect detail in the highlights. Same thing with the shadows. If you shot raw, you'll get more detail in the shadows. Now, if you shot JPEG, you can still do it, but you might find some weird artifacts. So just kind of look out for that. And whenever possible, try to get the exposure perfect in camera, but nobody knows better than me that that doesn't work out every time. Working our way down, the next is contrast. And I want you to look at the histogram for the contrast. As I drag the contrast down, everything moves into the middle and the picture starts to look washed out. As I drag it to the right, everything kind of separates, becomes shaped like a U. So it goes into the middle and then kind of shaped like a U depending on the contrast. So just do this to taste. Just pick whatever contrast you want. Different styles create different effects. One down is the highlights. And this is going to be exactly like dragging this rightmost part of the histogram. If you have a lot of blown out highlights and you want to save them, just drag that down. If you want really bright whites that really pop, drag it over to the right. The shadows work on the left part of the histogram here, just the darkest parts of the picture. So by dragging it left, anything that was kind of dark becomes completely black. And if I drag it to the right, anything that was really dark becomes middle gray. So here we actually might want to hide some of these details because they're kind of ugly. So I'm going to drop those shadows down and just hide some of that. Now the whites sound a lot like the highlights, but those are actually different things. Whereas the highlights kind of takes bright parts of the picture and smoothly blends them in, adjusting the whites up is going to just cause clipping. Anything that's almost white, if you adjust those whites up, is going to become completely 100% white. It's easier to show than to explain. So check out these whites on Chelsea's shirt. They're almost white if we look at the histogram. They're not quite blown out. If I drag this to the right, bam, it becomes just solid white with no texture whatsoever. It just looks completely flat. If I drag it down, we'll see more and more detail. You can start to see little shadows in there. That's really close. Let's go to 1:1. So looking at it closely again, drag the whites up, they become a solid white mass. Drag them down, we can see all the texture in the fabric. The same thing happens with the black. So let's look at her hair here. Her hair is almost black, but you can see a little texture. If I drop those blacks down, they become very dark. And if I drag them to the right, we recover a whole bunch of detail. And now stuff that was black is more kind of gray. It's somewhere in the middle. Now, there's an interesting thing to note about these slides here. Anytime you drag something to the left, it gets darker. Anytime you drag something to the right, it gets brighter in Lightroom 5. If you're used to previous versions of Lightroom, they changed this just to be more consistent. In previous versions, left or right could behave differently depending on the tool. But this one, left is always dark. That's really nice. Now there are 3 slides for the presence here: clarity, vibrance, and saturation. And they all behave a little differently. But I'm going to adjust that exposure down. That's bugging me a little bit. Clarity kind of finds edges and makes things pop. So if we bring this up, we'll start to see kind of selective contrast. So there's quite a bit more pop. Maybe they should have called it pop. If I drag it all the way down, you can see everything becomes washed out. There's almost no clarity. Where there was contrast, things just kind of become smeared together almost artistically. So you can do either of these to the effect that you want. They both become surreal at either extreme, but somewhere in the middle, you can add just a real subtle touch that nobody would notice. The vibrance works a lot like saturation, except it's actually more useful. It works on a different set of colors, basically. But if I drag the vibrance down, everything becomes very washed out. Here, it's almost black and white, but this is real black and white, and that's black and white with the almost black and white with the vibrance turned down. If I crank it up, it becomes way too much. Again, surreal at either end and subtle somewhere in between. Saturation is a different subject entirely. If I drag the saturation all the way down, you lose all color. and it's now completely exactly the same as black and white. Well, there's a few filters applied to black and white, but it is completely black and white with the saturation down. And with it up, everything is just the most bright color that you've ever seen. So the basic module is where you'll do almost all of your processing. I suggest you work from the top down and be as subtle as you can with it, because when people first get into Lightroom, the mistake that they make is they overdo it all. If you've been editing a picture for a little too long, you'll get into this thing where, oh, it looks a little better with a little more clarity, and then a little more clarity definitely helps. And before you know it, you've got that clarity slider all the way to the right and your picture looks kind of silly. So take a break, have somebody else look at it, come back to the picture, or just do what I recommend, and after you've made your adjustments, dial everything back by like 30%, because almost everybody has a tendency to over adjust, especially if you've been working on a picture for more than a couple of minutes. Now let's talk about the tone curve panel in Lightroom. And this is just yet another way to kind of adjust the brightness and shadows in your picture. I'll hide this basic panel here. You know what? I'm just going to reset all of this. I'll cover the history panel later, but I'll scroll down here and just click the original to quickly revert back to my original settings. Let's go to the tone curve again. Now, some of you, if you're an old Photoshop person, you'll recognize this tone curve. If you don't recognize it, you don't necessarily ever need to get to know it. I prefer to work with the histogram tool up top, but some of us just are in the habit of using particular tools. So this is your tone curve, if that's what you want. Just like the histogram tool, you can grab it and then just drag it up, and it kind of does the same thing. So now I'm grabbing the shadows and dragging them up, and as you can see, the shadows got brighter, the highlights weren't touched. I can drag the highlights down here. And basically what I've done is lowered the contrast by making this kind of washed out. So if I turn the tone curve off, you can see the histogram pops back into shape, and that's with it on, because I kind of moved everything into the center. I could also use this to increase the contrast by raising the highlights and dropping the shadows. Again, before and after. You can also decide where the middle point is and where the highlights are. So by doing this, I'm kind of raising the whites, just like I was by using this slider. It's the same kind of effect. I can make it drop some blacks too if I want. Now, as you make changes to these, you'll see that it's also making changes to these sliders below it. And whether you prefer to just grab this or use the sliders here is just a matter of preference. They do exactly the same thing. Now there's this little adjustment brush here. You can click this and then adjust part of the picture. So let's say I want to adjust the whites in Chelsea's shirt. I'll grab that, and you can see on the tone curve, it grabbed that exact spot in the tone curve. So it's just an easier way to select parts of the picture. For example, if I want Madeline's shirt to be more visible, I'll just hover the cursor over there and grab that. And you can see in the tone curve, it knows it's part of the shadows. Now I can just raise those up until I can see her shirt nice and good. Now notice as I'm adjusting these that Lightroom is kind of making my harsh adjustments into a nice curved shape. You can control exactly how it makes that curved shape. So let me just drag this up in the middle, and I'll kind of put an S curve in it that's kind of harsh. Now let's change the point curve from linear to medium contrast, and then to strong contrast. And that just changes the arc on the curve. So linear contrast provides the least severe curves in the arc, and high contrast provides the most severe curves in the arc. Now let's go over the cleverly named HSL color black and white panel. That's a mouthful. It'll make sense once you see it. Let's hide that tone curve and the basic curve, and we'll expand this curve. And basically this is 3 tabs that do very similar things. HSL stands for hue, saturation, and luminance, so it's kind of a confusing panel. If I switch to color, you'll see just totally different things, and if you switch to black and white, it then converts it to black and white. Starting with hue, saturation, and luminance, you can adjust them each independently, or you can show them all at once by clicking all. Hue changes your colors. So let's look at this green background back there. I can make that yellow, or I can make it more blue. If I drag it to the yellow, I can then keep pulling it until it starts to become orange and and red. Now we have a very different picture just by adjusting the hues. Use hues to selectively change colors in parts of your picture. But if you decide to do spot color, don't tell Chelsea because she absolutely hates that. Now let's take a look at the saturation panel. Saturation is a very selective thing. You can selectively, say, increase the saturation of the greens in the background. Or if I wanted to really highlight the kind of orangish of the setting sun, I could really crank that up and make it even more intense. You could also do spot color. Let's say I only want the greens in here. I'm gonna go ahead and drop everything else and just put all the emphasis on the trees in the background. That's a terrible example of how to use spot color. I'll just reset that, but hopefully you can see how that does work. So hue changes colors, saturation changes the brightness of the color, and luminance changes the overall brightness, whether something is completely black or completely white. And just like hue and saturation, you can adjust it on a per color basis. So under luminance here, maybe we want the background to actually be brighter. So I'll grab those greens and drag them up, and that's actually kind of nice. It adds a lot of contrast to it. Or I can make the background disappear to kind of de-emphasize it. And that's nice too, because it brings some emphasis to the foreground. So these are artistic choices and there's no right answer, but the power is in your hands here. You know, one thing I absolutely hate is those purples in Madeline's jacket. So I'll grab this little luminance brush and drag it over and just select that purple color. And now by clicking and dragging, I can pretty much make that super dark or super bright. So you know what, I'll make that a little bit darker and then I'll come over to the saturation and I'll grab that same tool and see if I can just desaturate it, just make it a little more like gray. So you can see that Lightroom figured out I was dragging something that was purple and magenta, and now if you look at it, it's completely gone. Those colors are completely gone. We can do the before and after here to really see what it looks like. So I'll hold the space bar to zoom in, and here before you could see the purple was really distinct, and here there's no purple whatsoever, it's just completely gray. Now I took a pretty harsh hand to it so it looks a little unnatural, but if I just adjust it a little bit up, now it's not quite so unnatural, and in fact it does de-emphasize it. So Lightroom can be extremely useful for kind of selectively choosing colors and which you want to have visual weight and which you don't want to have visual weight. So this can actually be an important part of the composition that you take care of completely in post. So now let's move over to the color tab, and you'll see it does basically exactly the same thing. It just lays it out a little bit differently for you. Here, maybe I wanted to rescue those magentas. You can see they're turned down because I adjusted them in the other panel. So I can crank those up and suddenly Mad's sweater comes back to life. So that's identical, and you can click all to see everything. For me, I generally prefer to use the HSL panel. Talking about going black and white, there's an awful lot of adjustments that you can make. I'll turn off the before and after. And these are things that black and white photographers did using filters. So it was common to put a yellow filter on a black and white camera to make grasses pop and stuff, or you might put a blue filter on for different effects. You can do this in post by taking color pictures and then processing them to black and white selectively. Chelsea has a great video on that in Stunning Digital Photography, but I'll just cover the highlights of it. You can see that by adjusting the reds up and down, I'm adjusting their skin tone. So often you want the skin tones to be just a little bit brighter, but you don't want to overdo it. Now, for the most natural effect, you don't want to say raise the reds and lower the oranges, because what happens is you see like the effect on their skin here looks just terrible. If you make an adjustment to an adjacent color, you want to keep it pretty similar. So if I want to raise the reds, I'll have to also raise the oranges to keep it natural, and then I want the yellows to be pretty close too. The greens pretty much control the grasses, and those are the only greens I have. So I can adjust those up or down depending on the artistic effect that I want. But the important thing to know is that with black and white, it's not just desaturating. You should take complete control over how bright each of the different colors is in your picture. Now let's go over the split toning panel. This allows you to separately adjust the color, the hue of your highlights and shadows. Split toning allows you to create kind of a sunrise or sunset effect. You know, during sunrise and sunset, The highlights will be nice and warm, kind of orange in color, and the shadows will be nice and cool. Well, let's dig into Lightroom. I've opened up a picture of an osprey with a fish here, and you can see kind of the background here is nice and blue, and the highlights here are nice and white. So opening up the split toning panel here, you can see separate adjustments for the highlights and shadows. So the first thing I'll do is adjust the hue. This is the color that I want to add to just the brightest parts of the pictures. So if I want to do a sunset look, I'll go and I'll pick orange for this. You can use the slider, you can also just pick this and kind of pick the color that you want. So I'll go up here with like a nice sunrise orange. And you can see with the saturation up here, it introduced a nice warm color to just the highlight. So turning it off, that's before, and this is after. But if you look at the dark shadows here in the water, you can see it's not changing color. So now, what if we want to make the shadows a different color too? For this, I will pick a nice cool color in the shadows. And right away, you can see this starts to become a little too surreal. That's too much. Like everything in Lightroom, you usually end up kind of backing it off a little bit. So that might be not enough, but I'll introduce a little more blues there. Maybe I'll just drop the saturation on the warms a little bit. So we'll click this to turn the split toning effect off and then back on. And you can see right away, this looks almost midday. The colors are kind of flat. And here we have what is distinctly a sunrise or sunset look. Now let's move on to the detail panel. The detail panel has all the pixel per pixel stuff. If you zoom in tight and you don't like what you see, it's probably the detail panel that you're going to use to fix it. So specifically, the detail panel allows you to adjust the sharpness of the picture and the noise reduction that goes into the picture. So if you zoom in tight and it doesn't look sharp, or if you see kind of grain, random colors scattered everywhere, you can probably use the detail panel to at least improve it. Now, neither sharpness nor noise reduction actually improve your picture quality. They just kind of improve the appearance. Of course, they don't go back in time and capture more detail than your lens and camera captured, nor can they reduce the amount of noise that your sensor captured. But they can do kind of tricks to make you think there's less, to reduce the visible effects of it. So it's always better to get a nice sharp picture in camera, and that can require a good camera and a good lens, and to get low noise pictures, and that requires using a low ISO with hopefully a big sensor. So Lightroom can't work miracles, but it can definitely make some improvements. So let's dig in. We'll start with this osprey picture. It's often wildlife pictures that you want to adjust the sharpness of. And expanding the details pane here, I can kind of, this is a close-up window that just shows me the close-up details of it. If I want to view a specific part of the picture, I can just click that and then click the part of the picture that I want to see. And for wildlife, it's the eye really that you want to adjust. So let's look at the sharpening slider here. If I drag this to the right, I'll drag it all the way over just so you can see the intense effects of sharpening. What sharpening does is, zoom this into 2:1. It looks for areas of contrast and then accentuates that contrast. So you can see in a typical picture, there's usually quite a bit of contrast. You can see by over sharpening it, I introduce a lot of weirdness into the sky. Now there's not a lot of noise evident in this blue sky here, but when I over sharpen it, suddenly you see the difference between every single pixel, and it just ends up looking pretty weird. The eye too on this bird just ends up looking strange when it's over sharpened. So I show you that so that you'll be aware of the effects of over sharpening, because that's one of the first things that people do when they start editing their pictures, is they always over sharpen their pictures, because when you add a little bit more sharpness, it always looks a little bit better. So you keep adding a little more and a little more and a little more until your picture looks crazy. So pick your sharpness level and then just keep backing it down until it gets noticeably worse. Let's get back into it here. Let's get a little more realistic with the amount of sharpening that we dial in. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to keep cranking it up a little bit at a time. 0 here looks a little soft to me. If I go up to 15, it looks better. I start to get up to like 45, and it does look sharper, but at the same time, you start to see some of that weirdness in the eye. 50, I think, yeah, it's getting sharper and sharper, but it's hard to find just the right point. Okay, I'm going to settle in right about there, right about like 25 or so. That's often actually the default for Lightroom. So we'll stick with 25 and then we'll explore some of these other options. Radius defines how far Lightroom looks from any given pixel for other pixels of contrast. So we can dial this down, and what will happen is the sharpening effect will be pretty drastically reduced. It's only looking half a pixel to each of the neighbors for the sharpening effect. But if we dial it up, what we'll see is kind of a different effect. Now, you know, you're not seeing a big difference on this particular picture, and indeed you often don't need to adjust the radius at all. It really depends on the type of photo that you're working with. So for me, for digital pictures, I pretty much always leave it at 1 pixel. If you're working with scanned film, you often end up increasing that. You might also, if you're dealing with a picture that's blurry because of bad optics, kind of like a cheap, low quality, like your kit lens. If the blur radius covers several different pixels, you might try increasing it. Basically, in summary, I wouldn't worry about it too much, but if you want to tweak it, you can see if you get a better effect by increasing that radius. It's going to help more if your picture is noticeably unsharp, but usually 1 is a pretty good default. So we'll leave that at 1. Now, detail tells you how much Lightroom is going to try to accentuate the detail. So we can increase this and we see that it does start to bring out the detail more and more, and has a similar effect to increasing the sharpness, but not quite the same thing. So as we increase the detail to 100, it does indeed look sharper. And indeed, like the fake veins in the eyes do get more and more distinct, but it's not the same effect as just raising the sharpening. It's a little more subtle. Lightroom also defaults to 25, and I'll often leave it there, but I think for this picture, to my eye, raising up the detail just a little more does help improve the overall look of the picture. The masking tool is the smartest part of sharpening because it will distinguish kind of your foreground and your background areas. It looks for parts of the picture that don't have any detail and separates them from parts of the picture that do have detail. So in our picture here, we have a nice blue sky, which doesn't have a lot of detail. And you notice when we over sharpened it, we started to accentuate the noise in the picture and it made the sky look really crazy. Wouldn't it be nice if Lightroom could kind of figure out which parts of your picture had interest and needed sharpening, and so it wouldn't sharpen the noise in the sky, which is silly? Well, that's exactly what masking does. So let's take a look at it. Now, there's a little trick I'll show you with the Alt key on your keyboard or the Option key on a Mac. So hold down the Alt key here, and now it does something a little different. As I drag this up, you'll see it turns the picture black and white. And what's happening as I drag it to the right is it's showing me which parts of the picture are going to be sharpened versus which parts are going to be ignored. So with masking at 0, you can see Lightroom is going to sharpen the entire picture because the entire picture turns white. As I drag it to the right, Lightroom starts to look for parts of the picture that don't have detail now and eliminates them. So all the black parts of the picture aren't going to be touched by the sharpening tool. And I don't want the sky to be touched, right? But I do want the bird to be touched. So I'm just going to drag that to the right until the sky is pretty much ignored, but the bird itself is still being sharpened. So isn't that cool? Lightroom has intelligently figured out which parts of the picture deserve sharpening. Now I'll zoom back in on the bird here, and now look what I can do. I can start to crank up the sharpening, increasing the sharpening of the bird without making the sky look crazy. So here you can see it's cranked all the way up. The bird looks crazy. If I drag the masking back down, the sky also looks crazy. So you can see by putting in a value of about 45 for this picture, Lightroom is able to kind of distinguish it. Now, it's not that smart. You can see around the edges of the bird here, there's a little badness that would require some feathering. Photoshop can do a smarter job of that, but Photoshop also requires extra software and takes a little bit of extra time. So now that we have that mask in place, I do think we might want to reconsider the amount of sharpening that we put in. So before I had it at 25, but if we're not going to be sharpening the sky too, we might be able to get away with just a little more sharpening. Let's check out the detail a little bit. All right, so here I was able to crank up the sharpening some without making the background look bad. Let's take a look at the before and after. That's before, which looks downright blurry, right? And that's the after. Maybe it's a little over sharpened. I was saying earlier we should always dial it back a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and dial it back a little bit. Before and after. Sharpening on wildlife pictures is basically standard. It might seem like cheating, but it's really not. It's just kind of optimizing your picture for display on screens and maybe in print. Let's move on and look at noise reduction. Now, we talked earlier about the noise in the sky up here, and indeed, even if you look really closely here, you can see that the sky isn't quite perfectly blue. It might not be completely apparent on video because you're watching this on video and the video's been compressed. So what I will do is I will try to accentuate the noise in the sky a little bit. So I cranked the contrast up and kind of zoomed in. So now we can see each individual pixel, and you can see the sky has a lot of blotchiness to it. Of course, the sky didn't look like that. It was one nice smooth color. So what can we do? We can use the noise reduction tool here. I'm going to crank this slider up some. And, as I crank it up, we'll see it go from being blotchy to just silky smooth. All right. Now we have a nice, beautiful sky. Why would you not crank the luminance noise reduction setting all the way up when it makes your sky look so good? Well, let's pan over a little bit and look at the bird's face. You can see we've basically lost like all detail in this bird. I'll go ahead and reset the contrast just so we can get a better sense for what it actually looks like. So that's with the noise reduction up, and that's with it off. Zooming back in. Noise reduction all the way up, noise reduction off. Just look at the detail in the feathers here as I crank the noise reduction up. You can see the detail in the feathers is completely lost. It looks nice and smooth, but it's just not the same picture. With something like wildlife, you really want to be able to capture all the details. You want to be able to see these individual feathers down here in the shadows. And if I crank that up, you can see they kind of just get completely lost. So it's always a trade-off between detail and noise in your image. And that's what the luminance slider under noise reduction does. It lets you just pick that perfect point between detail and ugly noise to make your picture just as beautiful as you can get it. Now the main adjustment there is the luminance, and you can get by with just using the luminance adjustment, but you also have the detail and contrast adjustments, which their names kind of make sense. Detail controls the amount of detail that is preserved. So as I crank this up, we're going to see some of the detail in the feathers come back. So that's with the detail all the way down. You can see these feathers get really lost. And that's with the detail all the way up. The default of 50 is usually good, but adjust it to taste. There's not like there's a particular rule. Now the contrast slider. Now what this is supposed to do is to kind of accentuate the contrast and allow you to recover some of the contrast that might have been smoothed out by the noise reduction. I have never seen that it does anything useful. So we'll just take a look at it in here. Now look at the picture of the bird here as I crank the contrast slider up. To my eye, I cannot see a single pixel changing as I'm cranking the contrast all the way up and down. And I've tried this on other pictures. So one less slider that you have to worry about, right? Let's move on to color, detail, and smoothness under noise reduction. Pictures will actually have two different types of noise, luminance and color. Luminance is going to be variations in brightness. So two pixels right next to each other, they might be exactly the same color in the real world. Like if you took a picture of the sky, a nice blue sky, every pixel should be exactly the same color. One pixel will be brighter than the next, which will be darker, and that's luminance noise, brightness. Color will mean that one pixel will be a little bit red, while the next pixel will be a little bit green, and the next pixel will be a little bit blue, even though they should all be the same color. So here we have the two different types of noise, and you can adjust both separately in Lightroom. Let's get into it. Now, Lightroom by default sets both the luminance and color noise reduction to 25. So to see that color noise, we'll drop this down to 0. And as I do that, what we start to see in the background here is blotches of mostly pink and blue, but there's green in there too. It all kind of just blends in together. I'll zoom in a little tighter and just fill the screen with the sky. Let's try bringing that contrast back up again so we can see it a little more clear. So here we do indeed see green, blue, and red, and ideally this would all be just solid blue. So what we can do is go back down to the detail pane here and drag the color noise reduction up. And so now what we have is much more of an even blue color to the sky. It starts to become much, much smoother. So again, without the color noise reduction and with the color noise reduction. Now we'll leave that up and adjust just the luminance noise reduction so you can see the difference. Here you can see all one color, but varying brightness. Drag the luminance noise reduction up. Now we have still all one color, but much more smooth brightness levels. So that's the difference. The color is at 25 by default. And again, you're just going to kind of adjust it to your own preferences. We'll bring that contrast back down. So there's no one right answer. You can adjust it up or down depending on the ISO level of your camera, the type of sensor that your camera has, just to taste depending on the picture. Now, with color noise reduction, you have options for detail and smoothness too, and these work a lot like the detail and contrast sliders under the luminance noise reduction. So let's take a look at those. So adjusting the color detail up and down in this particular picture, because it doesn't have a lot of color noise, it makes it a little difficult to actually see the difference. But detail is going to try to preserve the colors, and smoothness, as with contrast, will try to introduce more smoothness into the picture. So let's see if we can even see any difference with these. I do see that cranking the smoothness up smooths out the sky a little bit. I'll crank this contrast back up so that we can see some more of this detail in here. So here you can see cranking the detail all the way down, the color is much more smooth. If I crank it all the way up, it does try to reintroduce some of the detail, and in return what we see is more noise in the sky. We see more pinks and greens in the sky mixed in with the blues. So if that were important detail, then that would be a good thing. Now, you usually have more detail in the luminance channel than you do in the colors. So for that reason, if you want more detail, you might start with the detail slider under luminance rather than the one under color, but it depends on your picture. I'll leave that back at the default. Now with smoothness all the way up versus all the way down, all the way up, you know what? Just like the contrast slider, I cannot see any perceptible difference between having that at 0 and having it at 100. So adjust the smoothness all that you want, but my tests on different pictures didn't show any perceptible difference by adjusting it. One less thing to worry about, right? Now let's go over the lens corrections panel. This is a lot of fun, and it's one of the smartest panels in Lightroom. Every lens has some distortion to it. You'll see it. One of the most common types of distortion is vignetting, and every lens has a little bit of it at the corners of the pictures. If you take a picture of a completely solid color like a wall or the sky, if you look at the corners, especially on wide angle lenses, you'll see the corners are darker than the middle, even though the environment was completely even brightness. This is because of physics. It's just the way the lens gathers the light. You know, different types of lenses will have different amount of vignetting, and pro lenses have less vignetting than consumer lenses, but they all have vignetting. Well, the good news is that Lightroom can fix vignetting for you. It can also fix things like chromatic aberration and pin cushioning, but this will all make more sense once we get back into Lightroom. Here we have a picture that's pretty difficult for my lens to render correctly. It's a wide angle shot and it's really high contrast because I'm shooting into the sun. It's the silhouette of my daughter, Madeline. So just to show you what Enable Profile Corrections does, it's off right now. So this is the exact picture that my camera took. If I turn it on, we see some subtle differences, subtle but important differences. The first is that the picture is straightened. Now, it's not super obvious in this picture, but this has some distortion introduced by the lens. But as I turn it back on, we see that Lightroom has eliminated the pin cushioning that's in it. So that's without the profile corrections, and that's with. So besides the obvious changes to the shape of the image, I want you to look in the corners up here. As I turn it off, you can see this corner is fairly dark, And then as I turn it back on, the corner gets brighter, off and on. In fact, all the edges get brighter. The center, you'll notice, doesn't really change in brightness, but the corners do. And that's the vignetting effect that I was talking about. It's fixing vignetting. Didn't mean to turn on that blue highlight. So I'll turn on profile corrections, and already the picture is better. Enabling profile corrections is the only thing I do to every picture that I import. I just love profile corrections. They make all your lenses better. So let's go on to talk about chromatic aberration a little bit. So let's look at a high contrast area. We'll look at this post here because it has black to white, and that's where you'll start to see chromatic aberration. Notice on the right edge of this post, we see a blue highlight. And on the left edge here, we see orange. Now, this isn't the way our eyes saw it, and indeed it's not really the way the physical world is, but it's because blue wavelengths will travel differently through your lens than the reds and greens. They're just at opposite ends of the spectrum. They have different physical properties, and that's just what happens. But it's annoying, and for some lenses, it's more distinct than in others. You can see all down this left edge of the post here, it's orange. And over here it's blue. Some lenses will have like purples and greens instead. We'll just select remove chromatic aberration. And now look at it. Wow, instant, right? Here we see just true colors, no odd coloration. Select it again, blues and oranges, there, gone. So remove chromatic aberration is something you generally do want on Lightroom. Just looks for areas of high contrast, looks for the type of chromatic aberration that your specific lens has, and then tries to fix it for you. It's great. It makes your pictures better. It's like you bought a professional level lens. Lightroom fixes it for you. What a great value. Let's look at the other option here, constrain crop. Now, before we get into constrain crop, I'm going to show you how Lightroom can automatically level your picture. It's pretty cool, right? Because when you're hand holding a picture, even if it's on a tripod, you're almost never completely level, and it doesn't necessarily matter unless you have vertical or horizontal subjects in your frame. So if the horizon appears in your picture, like the flat horizon of the ocean, or there are vertical buildings, if you're a little bit off tilt, it'll be obvious and it'll reduce the quality of your picture. Well, Lightroom's so smart. It can look for horizontal or vertical lines, straighten your picture for you. This is a great thing to apply to your pictures automatically. Let's take a look at how that works. If you look at this picture, you'll notice it's off level a little bit. It's because I was hand holding it and I was chasing my daughter who's moving, but look at this line here off to the left. This, of course, is level. Whoever constructed that didn't put it in at like a 5-degree tilt. That's my problem. And these lines here, obviously they should all be vertical too, but they're tilted a little bit to the right. Well, look what happens when we click the full button here. Lightroom figures out that it's off level and it straightened it, and indeed it looks really great. So you have 3 options here for correcting your level. Level looks for horizontal features in the picture and tries to adjust the level based on that. Vertical looks for vertical lines in the picture. So you can use level if you have the horizon of the ocean in your picture, or use vertical if you're using buildings. But most of the time, I just find full works just great. Full uses a smart combination of both. So which of those options you pick kind of depends on the picture. But for the most part, you can just pick auto, and Lightroom will try to be super smart about it. Now we can go up to find out what constrain crop does. You can see that it adjusted the perspective and angle of my picture so that these lines are nice and straight, but it had to rotate it. So it left kind of white space over here at all the edges. Well, if I click constrain crop, it'll automatically crop out those white parts of the picture. And you can see even as I have that selected, if I'm switching between these options, then we'll go ahead and keep it fully cropped for me. So for the most part, you'll want to select all these check boxes and just leave that on auto, but you should know what they do in case you want to go back and change it. Now, I want to show you what will happen if you do this with a previous crop enabled. So I'm going to turn these off and go in and actually crop the picture manually. Let's just pretend that. I want to crop kind of into her hair there. What if I wanted to use the rule of thirds and put her right along the left third? So with that fairly tight crop, if I switch to auto, it's going to suddenly just reset my whole crop, right? Which would be irritating if I'd gone through the trouble of cropping the picture first. I'll undo that. And if I want to prevent it from doing that, what I'll do is I'll hold down the Alt key and then I'll switch to auto. And you can see it did try to keep my tighter crop. Of course, it had to rotate the picture a little bit, and that still introduced a little bit over here. If I do constrain crop again, it'll adjust that for me. So in summary, if you've already cropped the picture and you now want to introduce the automatic level correction, hold down the Alt key when you do it so it doesn't screw up your work, or just do it and then go back and recrop your picture later. The lens corrections panel has a few other tabs we can look at. Let's look at the profile tab first. The profile tab allows you to select which lens it's adjusting for. Each lens has slightly different chromatic aberration and profile corrections that are necessary, different vignetting. And Lightroom is smart. It'll look at the metadata in your picture, figure out which lens you have, and apply settings that are specific to that lens. So people take every lens in existence and point it at a test chart and figure out how much vignetting that lens has, how much pin cushioning, and then they plug it into Lightroom, and Lightroom figures out how it can correct all those things. It's different for different focal lengths of the lens too. So 24 millimeters, it's gonna have more vignetting than 105 millimeters on this lens that I'm using. For the most part, Lightroom will automatically find your lens for you, and you never have to worry about it. If you have a brand new lens, it might not appear here. So you can go in and manually select it. You can see that by changing the lens that I'm using, it does indeed change the how the picture is processed. So we can see it changing the pin cushioning just a little bit. You can always go back here and select auto, and it will automatically determine it for you. You can also determine the amount of vignetting that's occurring here. Here, I'll go back and reset the crop so we can see the entire picture corrected for a distortion, of course. Now, if I decide that it's overcorrected my picture, I can drag the distortion down, or if I want more correction, I can drag it all the way up. But like I said, these are pretty scientifically tested to match up exactly with the lens that you're using. So 100% is going to give you 100% of whatever they determined your lens needed, and usually you don't ever have to adjust these. You can also go in and adjust the color corrections that it does for, say, chromatic aberration on the color tab here. So you can turn off chromatic aberration here. It's exactly the same as clearing that checkbox, but with it on, you can control just how much defringing it does. So right now we have it on, and you can kind of see where Lightroom has determined I need my defringing. The purple hue is in this range and the green hue is in this range. Below the automatic checkbox, you can see tools for manually defringing it. I'll clear this so we can do it manually. And I'll pick this dropper here to kind of define the purple and green colors that we'll see. So this is the purple color, it's kind of the blue. All I need to do is to click that. And you can see that it adjusted these sliders to match the color that I selected. So that's a fairly narrow range where we'll see chromatic aberration on this lens. And if I slide this down, we'll see that blue color is there. If I crank it all the way up, we'll definitely remove all the colors in that range that are in areas of contrast, but we might get more than we wanted to. So generally it's better to keep it as low as possible. But for the sake of experimenting, I'll crank it all the way up, and you'll notice that we still see some blues in there. That's because these blues aren't in the color range that it automatically selected, just picking certain range of colors. So what I can do is include more of the blues here. So I'll drag this to the left until all my blues go away. So just so we can see the before and after, I'll drag this to the right and we can see the blues start to reappear. So I drag it to the left, they all disappear because they're all in this range that's defined as purple hue. The same thing can happen over for the greens here. So I'll take my dropper and select some of the greens, which include the oranges, and I'll pick that. And you can see that it selected the orange part of the green hue slider. I know it's weird that they're calling it purple and green, but what we saw on this lenses are blue and orange, but you don't even have to worry about that. Just pick the colors of chromatic aberration that you're seeing in your picture, and it will automatically choose the right sliders for you. So I'll crank the green slider all the way up just so we can see whether it's getting everything. And we do still see some oranges in here. So again, I think I need to expand the color range a little bit. Now, as we did with the other panels, we can use the Alt key to preview what's being selected. So I'm holding down the Alt key now and dragging this slider, and this is showing me all the chromatic aberration that's being removed. Now, if I change the purple hue slider here, we can see that as it gets smaller, I'm losing important parts of the picture. So what I want to do is just kind of adjust this so that I'm only getting the actual chromatic aberration parts of the picture and nothing more. So holding on the Alt key just makes it easier to visualize exactly what's being changed. That's pretty good. You know, clearly if I dragged it all the way over here, it'd be getting more than necessary, but we probably do want that. Great, so that just allows you to fine tune it. But again, using the automatic settings works pretty well for me. Now let's go on and just look at the last tab on the lens corrections panel, the manual tab. The manual tab allows you to manually adjust different parts of your picture. If we adjust the distortion up or down, what we'll do is we'll be correcting for the pin cushioning. So if I drag it all the way to the left, what you'll see is the middle part gets zoomed in, but the corners stay pretty much the same. So basically it makes the whole picture look kind of convex, like it's bulging out at me. And pushing it back, we'll see just the opposite. It gets kind of concave where it's all kind of pulling into the middle. Reset that to 0. The vertical transformation here will kind of stretch everything vertically until I get the perspectives just right. It can make people tall, right? You can use the vertical slider to kind of correct for perspective distortion. Perspective distortion happens if you're looking up at a building from ground level. You know how the building seems to get smaller at the top? That's because the top of the building is farther away from you, so of course it gets smaller. Some of that you can correct with the vertical distortion. We have some vertical lines in this picture so we can see it, but as I drag it to the left, what we'll see is these vertical lines will start to lean out towards the edges of the picture, almost like they're coming in at me. And they'll get taller too. If I stretch it to the right, they'll kind of pull in, almost exaggerating that height difference. For the most part, you never have to touch this. Just let Lightroom automatically adjust it for your specific lens. Here's the effect of the horizontal slider. You'll see she's getting stretched horizontally. Well, actually, I just noticed that I left the chromatic aberration settings up too high because we were experimenting with it. And you can see the negative effect of over adjusting for chromatic aberration. Just look at the edges here. Whereas the sky should be nice and orange, the Lightroom has tried to remove chromatic aberration by making this gray, and it does end up making it look a little weird. I'll fix that just because it will bug me otherwise. I'm holding on the Alt key and then I'll click Reset Defringe. You can see when I hold down the Alt key, it changes and allows me to reset it. So now we have the automatic chromatic aberration back on and we don't see any weird edges there. Okay, back to the manual tab. Now that I've fixed that, we can fix the rotation a little bit by cranking this to the side. I usually do that with the crop tool. And obviously, it's not going to be the same for every picture. The scale is going to just zoom in or zoom out for you. And the aspect will stretch the picture. You only need to deal with the aspect ratio if your camera has an unusual pixel shape. Some cameras have wider and shorter pixels, some are taller and narrower, but Lightroom should automatically figure that out for you, so you don't ever have to touch that, hopefully. But if you get an unusual camera, a brand new camera, and you want to manually apply those perspective changes, you can. Reset that back to 0. And of course, lens vignetting. I'll adjust this so we can see exactly what it's doing here. As I pull this down, you can see the corners get dark. If I crank it all the way up, you can see they get nice and bright. Let's make them completely bright, and then we can move the midpoint. The midpoint slider controls just how distinct or subtle the vignetting changes are. So as I move it towards the right, you can see the changes are more subtle. As I drag it towards the left, they become more extreme. Again, the default is usually just fine for most people. Now let's move on to the effects panel. Lightroom is really nice in that it can fix all the pin cushioning and vignetting of your picture, but you also kind of lose some of the lens's natural characteristics. And a lot of people like a little bit of vignetting. It makes pictures look vintage. It also adds some personality. And in fact, many photographers will shoot with older lenses just to kind of get that look. You might also not want to eliminate all the noise in your picture. After all, some of the most famous pictures ever had a huge amount of film grain in it. That grain adds a lot of personality. So Lightroom can clean up all that stuff, or it can actually add it back in to add some flavor, some spice to your picture. So let's jump into the effects panel in the Develop module. The effects panel down here, you can see that the top part allows you to select the post-crop vignetting. And so what I can do is, if I want dark corners, I can drag this down, and you can see I'm getting dark corners as if I shot with a super cheap lens. I can also drag it to the right and make the corners brighter. This is called white vignetting, and sometimes you'll see portrait photographers use it, but don't do it. It's a stylistic choice, but you know what? I think it's one that's kind of cheesy. I don't mind. If that's your artistic choice, that's okay. I like a little bit of dark vignetting myself often. Now notice that this is called post-crop vignetting. No matter how much you crop your picture in, the vignetting is going to happen after the crop, whereas all the lens correction stuff happens before the crop. So even if you crop it, it won't change anything because, of course, it's a property of your lens. If you want to introduce it, you'll want to use the post-crop vignetting. So you can see if I make these corners bright white and then recrop it, of course, it's not going to be around her head anymore. It's always going to be at the edges of the frame. So let's step back in time a little bit, do a few undos. Now, I'll make really dark corners here just to exaggerate the vignetting effect and show you the differences here. Now, once again, the midpoint is going to change the amount of contrast, kind of the smoothness of it. So you can see here the effect that it has. At the edges here, as I crank it all the way up, you can see the difference between the dark and the light is very distinct. Suddenly we have a hard line that's just at the corners. If I drag this all the way down, it's going to be a very gradual transition from the brightest part of the picture to the darkest part. Bring that back to 50. Roundness is kind of self-explanatory. It's going to change the shape of it from being nice, smooth oval all the way to the right here to being kind of a hard line here. So if I bring that in a little bit, we can see instead of being circular, it takes on more of the shape of the frame itself, the square shape. Now, as I drag this to the right, what we'll see is it becomes more and more actually round. The feathering kind of controls the transition too. If I drag it down, we end up with a nice hard line like a spotlight that we can then kind of change the size with the midpoint. See that? If I drag it all the way to the right, it gets nice and soft. So if I drag this to the left and eliminate the feathering, we can kind of see the difference that the roundness makes a little bit more distinctly. So here we see it becomes very square, and we almost have a framing situation going on. It's adjusting the midpoint. If I drag it here, it becomes very, very round, first becoming oval and then becoming completely circular. The highlight slider determines how much of the highlights of the picture shine through the vignetting. So you can see as I drag it all the way to the right, most of the highlights start to show through. It's usually all the way down, which is more of a realistic effect. So let's go back to the history panel here and we'll turn all of that back off. And now let's play with the grain effect a little bit. So first I'll just crank it all the way up so we can see what it does. And you can see, well, it starts to introduce grain. The grain setting is meant to simulate film grain, which tends to be a more pleasing effect than digital noise, even though in many ways they're very similar. If you wanted to make your picture look like it was shot on film and thus kind of vintage and aged, you could introduce some grain. So let's play with it a little bit more. All the way up here we see just some craziness going on in the sky, right? And that's all introduced in post. If I drag it down, it all goes away and we're back to the original picture. So of course we can adjust the amount of it to kind of get the effect that we want. And then we can adjust the size of the grain too. Different film emulsions had different grain. The grain is like a physical attribute of the film, little pieces of chemicals that would react with it. And sometimes they'd be in nice big chunks and sometimes they'd be really small. Low ISO film, like ISO 100, ISO 50 film tended to have really small, fine grain. If you shot higher ISO film, like ISO 3200, the grain would be in like big chunks that you could pretty easily see on like an 8x10 or an 11x14 print. So adjusting that size up and down, you know what? Just adjust it to taste. But if you wanted to be realistic about it, if you were simulating high ISO film, you'd use a larger grain. But really, it's an artistic choice. Just pick whatever you think looks good. So we can see with a smaller grain, it becomes very detailed, and with a bigger grain, it becomes a little blurrier. You can adjust the roughness to taste too. This kind of adjusts the contrast of the grain. So as we work towards making this picture look a little more vintage, I'll also drag down the vignetting a little bit just to make the corners a little more distinct. And so now we have a picture that has a certain personality to it. If I turn this panel off again, we see the original picture looks flat by comparison. If I turn that on, it starts to look much more vintage and natural. For an additional effect, I could even go completely black and white. And here as we turn it off and on, you can see we've drastically changed the picture. Use the effects panel to create your artistic vision for your picture, even if it doesn't technically improve the picture. Now let's talk about the camera calibration panel, the last panel in the develop module. This controls basically how much red, blues, and greens your camera's pictures produce, and you should never have to touch it. But if you've ever noticed that a particular camera seems to be a little more red or a little more blue than you might like, if you're just really, really nitpicky about it, you could go in and change the color calibration in Lightroom. You'll also notice under that panel that Lightroom over the years from 2003 to the current year has changed the process that it uses a little bit. Just the algorithm that it uses to generate your pictures from the data provided by your camera. So you can choose between those different processes. It's mostly going to be meaningful to those of us who've been using Lightroom for a long time and had previously developed pictures with an older version of it. So let's get into that panel. I've opened up a waterfall picture here from a beautiful spot in Ireland. And you can see right at the top here, the process shows that 2012 is the current process. But if I click this list, I can pick from earlier processes. So I do actually have a lot of pictures from, say, 2010. And if I open them up, they'll still be processed with 2010. Adobe has updated the algorithm they use to process your pictures from the original in 2003 and then again in 2010 and 2012. But when they do that, they don't want to go back and screw up all your pictures because you've already fine-tuned them and edited them. So they become the new defaults generally, but they don't update your old pictures. If you have an old picture that you've edited, you might want to pull it into the new process. It's as easy as clicking this list and then selecting it. But for the most part, you can just leave it at current. It's only required for older pictures. You can also select a different profile here. The Adobe standard is what I always use, but you can also render it according to what your camera originally saw or different settings within your camera, like the landscape setting or the neutral setting. You can see that each of these adjusts the colors and saturation and contrast of the picture a little bit. The default is Adobe Standard, and that's generally what I use. No matter which you use, you're just defining a starting point. So from that standard, you can always go in and adjust the contrast up and down or the saturation up and down and get to any final result. So you're just picking basically the defaults for yourself. Whatever you pick, you'll probably get used to it. The first slider here adjusts the tint of the shadows of the picture, like the dark areas here. So if I pull this up, we'll start to see just the dark parts of the picture turn green or more purple. So we can see the water here, which is nice and bright and white and is a highlight, isn't changing color. It's staying white. But all the dark parts of the picture are changing. Again, for the most part, 0 there is going to be right. Now you can also adjust the hue and saturation of the reds, greens, and blues. So if I found my reds were a little too red and I wanted them more orange, I could pull this to the right a little bit. Or if the reds were too orange and I wanted them more red, more purple red, I could pull it over to the left. And of course, control the saturation of them. You know, I don't have a lot of reds in this picture, so let's go down to the greens, which I do have plenty of. If I pull this to the side, you can see all the greens become a little more kind of aqua. And if I pull it to the left, they become a little more yellow. You could, of course, do something similar with the hue, saturation, and luminance panel up here. This is different. This is meant to be correcting problems within your camera. Only if your camera is rendering colors incorrectly. It's not meant for artistic adjustments. You should use the HSL and color panels for that. You can see the effect of the saturation tool. Bring it down, reduces the saturation, that brings it all the way up. It doesn't make the picture black and white to bring it all the way down because it's only meant to adjust and correct problems. And blue obviously does the same thing for the blue channel. You should understand that each pixel that you see in your picture actually consists of red, blue, and green pixels on your camera's sensor, at least on most modern sensors. And as a result, if you adjust the camera settings for the red, blue, or green channels, you might actually change what white or gray looks like. Again, you shouldn't ever need to change the camera calibration, but there it is in case you need it. Over in the bottom right corner of the develop module, you'll see the previous button. And basically, this is a quicker way to copy and paste settings between two pictures. Let's see how it works. So just as an example, I'll do something crazy on this picture. I'll just crop it in and I'll go wild with the rotation, and let's crank the exposure and contrast way up. All right, so we've made some crazy settings here. Now I will just jump to a different picture. This is almost the same picture. And I'll hit the previous button. Bam! It just copies and pastes whatever you did on the previous picture. You could also do it with Control-Shift-C to copy and then Control-Shift-V. In the very bottom right corner of the develop module, you'll see the reset button. And very simply, it just undoes all the changes that you've made in case you just screwed it up. Let's check it out. All right, so we've completely screwed this picture up. I just need to hit reset and bam, it goes back. If I do Control-Z, I'll show you the keyboard shortcut, which is Control-Shift-R. This is a great way to just fix all the mistakes that you've made. Or to do it before and after, you could do Control-Z and Control-Shift-R. Now we're going to go through the panels on the left side of the development module, starting with the all-important history module. The history module allows you to go forward or back in time. So if you screw something up, you can undo it. And there are a few tricks to it that I'll show you, but let's jump right into it in Lightroom. Here I've got a picture of the Calatrava Bridge in Ireland. Beautiful night shot. I love this location. As you can see, I have the history panel open here, and I had made some changes. I went ahead and undid them by selecting the last change here. Let's go ahead and do a few more changes. Looking at this picture, I can see some of these highlights are really blown out. And because I shot this in RAW, I should be able to recover some of those highlights. I'm going to grab the highlight slider here and just pull it down a little bit. There we go. See how all that detail came back in? As I pull it up, you see the details around here get lost, but it's easy for me to drag it down and just show more and more detail. So now that I've done that, if I want to jump back in time and undo the changes I made, I just have to click it in the history list here. It's a real quick way to go back or forward in time. Might want to make a couple other changes. If I look at this, I see that some of these shadows are kind of green. So I might want to just drag the tint up a little bit away from the green slider and just find a little more neutral color. That's a subtle change, but I think it improves it. And again, I'll use the history panel to kind of do a before and after just for the last step. So that's before the tint, and that's after the tint. And I like to do this as I go, just to make sure that the changes I'm making are actually improving the picture and kind of make sense. Another thing, looking at it, I think it might be just a hint off level. So I think I might just rotate it just a little bit to the left, just to try to straighten out that horizon a little bit. Once again, I'll just make sure that I made it better and not worse. And yeah, that's just a hair straighter. Maybe I want to raise the shadows up just to bring out a little more detail in the sky. There we go. Now we see just more rich colors in there. I like the way that's looking a lot. So here we've made just a few changes, and I can use the history panel over here just to jump forward or backwards to any given state, or to go all the way back to the beginning. Now, another useful thing you can do is to make a snapshot, because I don't know about you, but sometimes I get a little creative with my pictures and I go down a path of 9 or 10 things and realize, oh, you know, I'd like to experiment with it, but that particular experimental path didn't work out. I might want to undo it. So I'll show you how you can use a snapshot to allow yourself to quickly jump back. Let's say I like the way it is now and I want to take a snapshot of it. I'm going to right click here and then click create snapshot, and then I'll name it. I'll just name it first pass, and I'll click create here. And now under the snapshots panel, you'll see it shows first pass. Now, let's say I want to get creative and I'm going to try to go black and white with this. And, you know, maybe I'll do some crazy stuff like bump up the clarity and, you know, really up the contrast. Okay, so that's a very different picture. And you know what I'll do now is I'll make another snapshot of that. I'll call it contrasty black and white. Well, you know, I come back to this later and I realize this is definitely too contrasty for me. So I'm going to just overall just drop the contrast on it a little bit, smooth it out some. And okay, now in my current state of mind, I like this picture a little bit better, so I'll save a snapshot of that too. I'm just going to right click the current state in history and create another snapshot, smooth black and white. So now what I've done is I've created 3 different snapshots, and I can real quickly jump through any of these to remember where I was in that particular moment in time. And as you can see, these changes also go into the history. You can very quickly make a snapshot at any time by just pressing Control N. There's one more trick I want to show you about snapshots, and that's the ability to update a snapshot. So we'll jump back into Lightroom here. And so now I'll go back to the contrasty black and white, and let's say I just make some wacky changes, and maybe I crank up some of the colors here. Okay, so now I have a very different picture. If I want this to be my new contrasty black and white, all I have to do is right-click the snapshot that I want to replace and select Update with Current Settings. So now when I pick contrasty black and white, you can see it goes back to those settings as I change them, with the red cranked all the way up here. So you can easily overwrite a snapshot anytime you want. Now you notice I was doing a lot of comparing of before and after. Well, Lightroom provides tools to make this really quick and easy, the before and after tools. And I really want to point out some of these keyboard shortcuts. These are important shortcuts to learn because this is a tool you will use all the time. And being able to access it really quickly will make your workflow go much faster. So remember, /Y, Alt-Y, and Shift-Y. And as you use those, your fingers will kind of remember what they are. Let's dig into Lightroom and do some before and after. So first I'll just press the / key to pull up the before. Pressing / repeatedly rotates through your original before picture and your after picture. Now you could do this at any time using the history panel too, just by scrolling down to the very first item. That's showing you the before, and then selecting the last item that's showing you the after. But simply showing the before and after is easier, and you don't risk overwriting your after by making some changes. In other words, if you were to select the original before here and then decide to make a change to it, what happens is you lose your whole history. So you don't really want to do that. Now you can always Control Z, undo it, and get your history back, and that's a great trick to know. Or if you've made snapshots, you can always jump back to those because those don't get overwritten. But the point I really want to make is that learning the before and after can save you accidentally screwing up your picture. So remember, / just switches between before and after. This is a great thing to show a client if you've done some editing and you just kind of want to show off what the changes are, because it does it in place. So now let's look at what you can do with Alt-Y and Shift-Y. Real quickly, pressing Shift-Y pulls up the before and after in a split screen view. So I see the left part of the picture over here on the before and the right part on the after, and then there are some keys down here that let me, say, swap them before. If I want to see the after on the right side and the before on the left side, which is a little more logical, that's a simple thing to do. I can also press Alt-Y to rotate this. Instead of being left and right, now we see it top to bottom. And by continuing to press Alt-Y, it goes back to being full screen, or once again, the split screen. So Alt-Y switches between split screen and full screen, and Shift-Y rotates between the different modes that you can get. So here we have top and bottom. I'll press Shift-Y to go to the split, and then Shift-Y again to separate it. Or I can press Alt-Y to switch between full screen and the before and after view. Once again, pressing Y will rotate between the different modes. If you ever forget the keyboard shortcuts, I highly recommend learning the keyboard shortcuts again because it can speed things up so much. But there are controls down here to allow you to manually select it. So practice with the keyboard shortcuts, and whenever you get confused, go back to the controls. You'll also notice a checkbox for soft proofing. And if you select this, Adobe goes into kind of a print preview mode. Of course, it's really difficult to preview how something looks on paper when you're using a screen, because paper is a reflective surface. It's about light is bouncing off of it and back into your eyes, where a screen's projected directly towards you. And there's no perfect way to do it. Nonetheless, it can be useful when printing. I'll show you quickly how to turn it on. There's just a checkbox down here that you turn on and off. When you are soft proofing, the background becomes white, kind of simulating paper. And it might change the appearance of some of the colors here. You can see that this panel will appear on the right side, allowing you to switch between sRGB and Adobe RGB. You will just ask your printer to determine which of those two that you would want to use, but generally Adobe RGB is going to be fine. There's not a whole lot of purposes for you to use soft proofing, but we will go more into detail about printing in a later lesson. Now I'd like to talk about one of the most fun things you can do in Lightroom, and that's using presets. Presets gather together a ton of settings, whatever settings you have, and apply them to a picture all at once. So let's dig in and see how that works. Here's kind of a crazy picture. This is a fisheye picture that I took by laying on the ground and pointing up, and this is also in Dublin. And so jumping into the library mode here, get rid of some of those menu bars by pressing Shift F. I'll just make some changes to it. Let's say I like kind of a desaturated look. That's something that's been common lately. But I want the oranges and reds to be kind of hyper-saturated. So kind of what I'm doing now is I'm just kind of giving it some edgy processing, doing some unusual things to it. Bump up these two. And you know what? I'm going to drop the blues just completely. Just basically go black and white with the blues. All right, so I'm not saying that this set of settings is going to be gorgeous or anything, but it's a creative set of settings. And if we decide that we like it, we can go in later and save it to a preset and then quickly apply it to any picture. So now that I've made these settings, I'm going to go over to the presets panel over here on the left and click the plus sign. And you can see it prompts me to create a new develop preset. So I'm just going to call this Funky Reds. And you can see here that it has selected all the different options I can basically select. So I can select which of these I want to save as part of the preset. And I didn't use most of these. I didn't use sharpening or clarity or any of that. All I did was apply the saturation and clarity. But I'll go ahead and save all the tone and the white balance, the treatment, the color, and these. But I definitely didn't change any of these. Great, so now you can see it added a preset for me. Under user presets, there's Funky Reds. So what I can do now is use that preset and apply it to any picture. So I'll go back to my grid view here, and I'll take this picture of a duck, and I can go and push Funky Reds and immediately get those same settings applied to the picture. And it's such a quick way to do things, especially in an era where photographers spend so much time applying sepia tones and vignetting and other cool effects. You find yourself applying these same effects to multiple pictures, especially for a working portrait or wedding photographer. You can do it so quickly when you make yourself a few presets. But that's not the coolest thing about presets. The coolest thing about presets is you can get presets from other photographers, often free, and apply them to your pictures, and this can really spark some creativity. So let's jump into a web browser and go see if we can find a free preset. So I'm just going to search for free portrait Lightroom presets. There we go. Google even suggests it for me. And you can see there's a ton of websites that come up. I've worked with these digital photography school guys before, so let's see what they have. Let's try Presets Heaven here. All right, I'm just going to grab whatever the first thing is. Where's the download? Download, download, download. All right, free download. So it came down as a zip file, and if you're not familiar with zip files, usually you can just double click them and they'll open up to reveal the files inside. And as I dig in a little bit, you can see it has a couple of presets in here. Now, if we get into the file, you'll see this Mac OS X folder, and that has nothing of value to you. You don't have to worry about it. What we do want is the wedding look folder here. And as I dig in a little bit, I'll see that there are files with a .lr template extension. And those are the files that I really want. So I'm just going to copy those files to the clipboard. Now I need to find the Lightroom folder that stores my presets. So what I'm going to do is go back into Lightroom here, pull up the menu bar, and under Preferences, going to the Edit menu and then selecting Preferences. I need to go to the Presets tab up here, and there's a button here called Show Lightroom Presets Folder, and this just tells you where the folder is. So I'll click that, and you can see it opens up Explorer for me. Something similar will happen on a Mac, but it doesn't actually show you the Lightroom Presets folder. I don't know why they named the button Show Lightroom Presets Folder when they don't do that. All you have to do is dig in, double click that, and then after you open up the Lightroom folder, there's another folder called Develop Presets. So underneath the folder that opens, it's always going to be under Lightroom and then Develop Presets. And now you can see it has a couple of folders here for Lightroom presets and user presets. We'll call this a user preset, and I'm going to make a new folder for it called Free Wedding Presets. Just Free Wedding. I'll select that folder, and then I'm going to paste the LR template files in there. So basically, just grab those LR template files from wherever you can find them on the web and drop them into a subfolder of your developed presets. Now, once they're in there, what you'll want to do is to close Lightroom and then reopen it, because Lightroom is prompting me to back up, and I'm going to skip it for now. Lightroom only looks for presets the first time it starts up. So you just have to restart Lightroom and you'll be able to see those presets. So let's fire up Lightroom again. And now in the presets panel, we can see Free Wedding. It takes on the name of the folder that I gave it. So that's a useful way to organize them. All I have to do is select this and bam. I can switch between the presets that I just downloaded. And like I said, this isn't photography. It's post-processing. But using other people's presets can be a great way to spark your own creativity. And I do this all the time. On my main computer, I have more than 100 presets that I've downloaded from other photographers. And if I have a picture that I like, I'll just go through the different presets and kind of see what it looks like according to what they thought was cool. And I never end up just using another photographer's presets. Instead, I'll use them as inspiration. Maybe I'll see one that's kind of sepia toned, or one that switches it to black and white, but is contrasty or not contrasty. And that leads me down a path of creativity until I finally get to a set of processing that I really like. So downloading free presets is fun. You'll see a lot of sites that try to sell you presets, and go for it if you want. I haven't found the need to ever buy presets because there are a lot of good free resources available too. And of course, you can always make your own presets anytime you want. I have created some free presets that you can download and use. These are just some of the ones that I personally use. If you want to download them, go to sdp.io/free presets. Here's another way to import presets. Once you download the presets, it's often going to come in a zip file like this. You'll need to show it in the folder and then extract it, because you have to pull the LR template files out of it. So I'm going to extract all of them. It's going to be different on every computer, but now I have a folder with the LR template file in it. So just to make things easier on myself, I'm going to copy the folder path to the clipboard. You don't have to do this. You can just browse for it later, whatever you want to do. But jumping back into Lightroom, so now I'll select the LR template file, wherever it ended up, and click Open. And you can see it added it in based on the file name to the preset folder that I had selected. So now I can just easily switch to the different preset, get all these different looks. If you make changes to a preset, for example, maybe I just want less highlights here. Maybe I want the contrast just to be out of control. And here, just so we can see it, I'll bump the vibrance way up. Now, if I want to update one of these, I can just right-click it and then select Update with Current Settings. And then just like when I'm creating a new one, I need to select the settings that we're going to convey and click Update. Now I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of all the changes that I made to this picture. And I'm going to show you a trick that I use to speed up my processing. I use a default preset. Every time I import a picture, I have this preset applied to every single picture. So as you can imagine, I don't do anything crazy with the highlights or the contrast or the saturation or anything. All I really do is apply automatic lens correction. So this is an easy thing to do for any change that you want to make to all of your pictures. So I'm going to go down here to lens corrections and just make sure enable profile collections is selected and that it is set up to auto. So now this will automatically select the lens that I'm using. Now I'm going to save that as a preset. So I'm just going to click create new preset here, make sure it's in the user presets folder, and I'm going to call this default. And let's uncheck all of that, and I'll just make sure I have the lens correction selected. Then I'll click create. So now whenever, if I go in and change this, if I turn that off, when I click default, it'll automatically select that and apply the lens corrections, which means it'll fix any distortion in the lens. It'll remove some of the chromatic aberrations, whatever. It'll do the best it can with the lens that I was using. So now that I've created that preset, I can have it applied automatically to everything just by right-clicking it and then selecting apply on import. That's all it takes. You'll see the little plus sign there. Now the next time I import pictures, it'll automatically have those lens corrections applied to it. Now let's talk about syncing settings across multiple pictures. And this is another really common thing that photographers do. This happens to me all the time because I'm flaky. I'll adjust the exposure compensation, say down one stop, and then forget to set it back. And then I'll go on taking pictures and not notice that the exposure compensation is down. And what I've done is I've ended up taking 100 pictures that are all underexposed. So you could go into each individual picture and adjust the exposure in Lightroom to fix the problem. But if you use different synchronization techniques, you can make that happen in just a few seconds rather than having to apply it to each individual picture. So let's talk about the different ways that you can apply settings to multiple pictures. So here are a set of pictures of a little killdeer. I don't think you could kill a deer. He seems really cute and nice, but that's what he's called. And I can see that they're almost the exact same picture because with wildlife photography and lots of types of photography, you'll bang out 10 pictures and then just pick the one where the head position is right or the lighting is just right. So I have this series of pictures and I'll just apply the same settings to all of them because they're almost identical. So with all of them selected, I click the first one and then shift click the last one to select the entire range. I'll go into the develop module and see this little switch down here? I'm going to click it. So now auto sync is turned on and I'll pull up this panel here so that we can see the range of photos while I'm editing them. So I have auto sync on and the other pictures are displayed down here just for my convenience. Now let's say I convert them all to black and white because that'll be easy to see. You can see it changed this picture, but then all the other pictures changed instantly too. And that's the power of auto sync. I'll undo that and of course it undoes it for everything. If I turn auto sync off and convert it to black and white, my picture changed, my main picture changes, but these other pictures remain still in color. So I'll undo that and turn auto sync back on. And let's make a couple more practical changes. You know, this is a pretty solid picture. It doesn't seem underexposed. It seems nice and sharp. Maybe it could use just a little cropping. So I'll just go a little tighter in with these. As a wildlife photographer, that's automatically cropping a whole series of pictures is a really quick way to make it easier to preview pictures up close. And you'll find that your camera moves up and down and left and right a little bit, and therefore the crop won't be perfect on all the pictures. But often having it synchronized cropping across multiple pictures gets you closer. It makes it a little faster when you do go in and edit those later pictures. But for the most part, you'll end up just picking the sharpest picture and working more on that one. So for wildlife photography, I often use auto syncing just as a shortcut, a quick way to let me look at just the most important part of the picture so that I can determine specifically that the eye is sharp when I'm going through 100 pictures. I don't have to manually zoom in on everyone. So with those pictures automatically cropped and synchronized, I'll show you how to manually sync different pictures. So I'll select just the one picture here, and as you can see, the synchronize option completely disappears. It only appears when you have multiple pictures selected. So with just the one picture selected, let's do some crazy stuff to this. You know what? Let's go over to our presets. We'll try out these wedding presets on this bird. See if we can do something funky with it. Let's put on some heavy vignetting. All right, now we have just a real kind of artsy hipster killdeer here. And I'll show you a really quick way to synchronize settings. You can go up to the settings menu here and then select copy settings. And you'll notice the shortcut is Control-Shift-C. So Control-Shift-C, once again, I get to select which of the settings I'm going to copy. To make life easy, I'm going to select everything and then copy it. And what Lightroom has done here is copied all the settings for this picture into the clipboard. Now I can select any other picture, go up to the settings menu, and select paste settings. And it just pastes the settings for me. I almost always use Control-Shift-C and Control-Shift-V to do this. You can also do it from the library module. It's a real quick way to do it. I'll just select that picture, Control-Shift-C. Once again, it prompts me to determine which settings I want to copy. And then I can go to any other picture here and do Control-Shift-V. I could also select a range of multiple pictures and press Control-Shift-V. So now just instant hipster effects on all the pictures I could ever want to copy them to. Let's look at another way to sync. So what I'll do now is I'll select this set of 5 pictures, and this is in the library mode, and I'll click Sync Settings. And once again, it prompts me just as it did before. I'll leave everything selected and click Synchronize. And what you can see is it's hipsterized all 5 of the pictures. I'm going to press Control-Z to undo that. So I have 2 hipster pictures here and 3 non-hipster pictures. I will just click this non-hipster picture here. And you can see I still have 5 pictures selected because they're highlighted like this. But one of them is the active picture, and that's the one that's in bright white here. And I'll click Sync Settings again. And what Lightroom does is it's going to take the settings from the active picture, the one that's in bright white, and apply it to everything you have selected. This is exactly the same as Control-Shift-C copying and then Control-Shift-V pasting across multiple different pictures. It's just a different way to do the same thing. Pick the one technique that you like the best, auto-synchronizing, manually synchronizing, copying and pasting, and just do that. Or if you prefer, just make presets out of things and apply that preset. It's nice to have different ways to do it because we all have different styles of working. So what happens when the Lightroom Develop module isn't enough? What happens when you want to do something more serious with your pictures, some really hardcore editing, like something that requires layers, if you want to replace a background maybe, do some hardcore cloning or feathering, something like that, you'll want to go into Adobe Photoshop. Because Lightroom is very helpful, and it can do 95% of the editing that most of us need. But Photoshop gets the last 5%. And if you're doing a portrait or a commercial photo, you really want to take it that 100% of the way to get your best work. So now I'll show you how to get your pictures easily from Lightroom into Photoshop for hardcore editing, and then back into Lightroom where you can do final touch-ups and export it and print it, etc. So let's jump into Lightroom and we'll pop back into the grid view, hide this away, and let's pick a picture that we want to bring into Photoshop for some more work. Here's a nice close-up of a flower, and it's a pretty picture, but it's a real flower in the real world, and so you can see it has little marks on it and little things that you might want to clean up if you're going to use the picture commercially. So I want to bring it in Photoshop for this. I'll just right-click it, select Edit In, and then I'll select Photoshop. And you can see that there are some other options here, but generally, as long as you've installed Photoshop, this option will exist and you can select it. So I'll select that. Lightroom is going to start up Photoshop. So now I have the picture in Photoshop, and you can see the file name here is DNG. It brought the raw file in, so I could make raw level adjustments to it if I wanted to. All I'm going to do is, just for the sake of example, I'll just erase some of these ugly things down here. And usually what I'll do for that is I'll just use the healing tool. There we go, the spot healing brush. This isn't the Photoshop tutorial, so I won't spend too long on this, and yeah, Lightroom has a tool pretty similar to this. You usually wouldn't have to bring it in, but it's an example, right? So I'll just get out these black spots, no big deal. Touch them up. Okay, so I've kind of cleaned up just this one corner of it. I'll zoom back out so we can see it. Now I'm just going to, I'll just close all of Photoshop. It asks me if I want to save the changes to the DNG file. And so that is actually a little bit misleading because you can't save changes to a DNG file. A DNG file is a digital negative file. This is basically a converted format for the RAW file. And the name kind of implies digital negative. Negatives were things that came out of your camera, the raw film, and they couldn't be changed. You could airbrush a print if you wanted to, but you never really modified the negative. So I extend this digital negative metaphor to the real world now because Photoshop will not modify your DNG file with the changes you made. Instead, what it will do is it will save a new file. So it's kind of misleading. It's telling you it's going to save changes to your current file. It's just going to create a new file and then pull that new file into Lightroom. So click yes to save the changes without too much stress. I'll click yes now. Photoshop closes, and now I see my new picture in Lightroom. But if I open up this bottom panel to show the name of it, you can see that it's the same name, but now it has -edit and a .tiff extension. So Photoshop created a new file and then added -edit.tiff, changing the file extension, and it's no longer a DNG file, it's now a TIFF file. But you'll see those little spots that were here are completely gone. So I'll jump into the grid view once again by pressing G, and you can see this. It says 1 of 2 and 2 of 2. Lightroom has automatically imported the new file, which is a TIFF file instead of a DNG file, and then stacked it with the original file. I could click that and stack them together, and now all I would see by default is the edited file. That's a great way to do it. Because after I make a change to a picture, I might want to go back to the DNG file, but for the most part, I'm going to want to work with the file that I edited. So I want to keep that DNG file, the digital negative file, around just in case something goes wrong. I change my mind about my edits. But for the most part, I'm going to be working with the Photoshop edited file. Either way, because of virtual stacks, I can work with either one as I choose. Pull this into the develop module in here. You can see I have the DNG file selected and all those are in there. I can switch back to the edited TIFF file and they disappear. So the answer to a common question, how do I get my pictures from Lightroom into Photoshop, is it should happen automatically. And if you have both tools installed and you don't see that option on the right-click menu to open it in Photoshop, what I would do is reinstall Photoshop. It should communicate with Lightroom and say, hey, I'm over here. You can open up your files there and it won't be a problem. Here's another common question that I get regarding Lightroom and Photoshop is, which should I use for my editing? And for me, the answer is I always start in Lightroom. Lightroom is my tool for organizing my photos and doing quick, light editing. When I need to, I'll do the deeper editing in Photoshop. But then I always bring it back into Lightroom and continue working in Lightroom from there. So the process is always importing into Lightroom, light editing, deep editing into Photoshop when necessary, and then back into Lightroom for exporting it to a JPEG, sharing it, printing it, and often further cropping and light editing. Lightroom is a non-destructive tool. It will never overwrite your files. Photoshop will never overwrite your DNG files, but if you edit a TIFF file in it, you can make permanent changes to it. So because Lightroom is recording the changes and is non-destructive, it means you'll never mess up your original pictures. And that's why I love Lightroom so much. It's one of the huge advantages of it. So let's look at how you can open up Photoshop or a different tool manually if it's not automatically registered for editing. I'll go into the edit menu here and then select Preferences. On the Preferences dialog box, I'll select the External Editing tab. And here you can see that it has a box set up for editing in Adobe Photoshop. And I can now pick the format that I want to use. TIFF is the most common format. PSD is just an old Adobe proprietary file format, and both will give you the same results, basically. I just prefer TIFF because it's a little more commonly accepted. You can select the color space. The default color space is generally fine. If you need a different color space, you'll probably already know it. 16 bits is almost always going to be what you want. The resolution here matters not at all. People think this controls the detail or the size of the file. It doesn't. What it does control is what they call the DPI. The DPI is the dots per inch. And you can hear from that per inch part of it that it only matters when there's a physical set of inches there. If you actually make a print, the dots per inch can be important, but honestly, it's not generally. Anyway, it still doesn't matter. If you upload your pictures to MPix or some other site to make prints, They're just going to print it at whatever size you tell them and ignore the dots per inch. The only time the resolution or DPI setting can be important is if you're a designer and you're laying it out. But even then, the designer's just going to change it. So I'm telling you a lot of words to basically, in summary, completely ignore that resolution setting. Just leave it, because it really makes no difference to how photographers work. Down here, the last option is the compression type. TIFF files can be compressed, and that will save space. And again, this doesn't really matter. The zip is generally the best type of compression, and it's pretty universally compatible nowadays, so it's just fine. In other words, all those settings, all the default settings are fine. You don't need to touch any of them, but there they are. Now, if you want to go into an external editor, you'll use this portion of the dialog box down here. They have some presets. Under application here, you'll pick choose, and then go and find your editing tool. So maybe what I'll do is see if I can find old MS Paint. Ah, there we go. MS Paint, the worst editing tool ever. And I'll have it edit it as a JPEG file. And now I'll click the preset list here and save the current settings as a new preset. I'll just call it Paint. So now I'll click OK. And here, let's pick this other picture, which is similar, but not the same picture we edited earlier. I'll right click it, click Edit In, and then I'll select Paint. And here, Adobe prompts me, though it doesn't give me any options here. I can either edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments, I can edit a copy without any Lightroom adjustments, or I can edit the original. And you can see the fine print here says it doesn't apply to RAW or digital negative files, because Paint cannot process digital negative files or RAW files. So it's coming out as a JPEG file. So those two options are not available because I'm working with a RAW or digital negative file. My only option is to edit with Lightroom adjustments. So I'll just click Edit It. And you can see up here that Lightroom exports it as a JPEG because it was a DNG file. Then it launches Paint and opens up my picture. So this picture is awfully big for this monitor, but you can see I can scroll around and see everything in it. Anyway, point being, this worked just fine. There's my picture in an external editor. And you definitely wouldn't want to use Paint if you had Photoshop, but you might have a different tool that you like better. GIMP, for example. You used the free alternative to Photoshop, GIMP. You could integrate it into Lightroom so that it was only a couple of mouse clicks away. And I will go in and just do a quick edit on here so we can see what happens when I re-import it back in. I'll just zoom back and just write my name, because that's the kind of guy I am. So wow, a signed picture. Okay, so now what I'll do is I will close Paint and click Save. And after a moment, Lightroom re-imports it back in. And as you can see, it's still stacked in. We can see my awful JPEG edits here, or we can go back to the original DNG file. But the point I wanted to make is that you can integrate in just about any external editor, and Lightroom will automatically export the pictures in a format that it can handle, and then after you've done your edits, re-import them and stack it with the photo. I do want to show you one more option about working with external editors. So we'll go back up to Edit Preferences, and on the External Editing tab, you can see there's an option here. If you don't want your edited picture to be stacked, just clear that. It's as easy as that. For me, I love having it automatically stacked, so that's gonna always be my preference. We have a lot of different training materials available for you. Of course, I have many other Lightroom lessons as well. If you're interested in learning photography, I suggest you check out my book, Stunning Digital Photography, or our DVD and Blu-ray video training series. If you're interested in camera gear, check out my photography buying guide. And of course, if you're interested in learning Photoshop, my lovely bride Chelsea has an entire video training series on that as well. So check out those options as you begin to learn more and more and get deeper and deeper into photography. Thanks.